she was the one who built it all. Every contract, every shell company, every meeting that made a criminal empire look like a legitimate business. Serena Hayes, a black woman with a legal mind sharper than any blade in that organization, had given 7 years of her life, her career, and her silence to a man who called her his wife in private and his inconvenience in public. And on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, in a boardroom she had helped design, Kwon Jae-ho, the Dragon, one of the most feared Korean Mafia bosses on the West Coast, slid a document across the table and told her to sign. He was replacing her. Not with someone more qualified, not with someone who understood the architecture of everything they had built together, but with his mistress, a woman in a red dress who could not look Serena in the eyes as she stood behind him, holding her designer bag, already wearing the title that belonged to someone else. And the reason Jae-ho gave? Tradition. 7 years. And all she was worth was one word. Serena looked at the document. She looked at him. And then she smiled. Not the smile of a woman who had accepted defeat. No. It was the smile of a woman who had just been handed the only thing she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. A reason. What happened next did not just ruin him. It dismantled everything he had spent a decade constructing, brick by brick, name by name, secret by secret, using the very knowledge he had trusted her with because he never once believed she would use it. He forgot one thing about the woman he dismissed. She was a lawyer first, and lawyers never walk into a room they cannot walk out of. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a member and help our channel. There are moments in history and in life that do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with thunder or with warning. They arrive quietly, dressed in formality, seated at the head of a table that someone else built. They arrive looking like routine, looking like paperwork, looking like a signature on a Tuesday afternoon that nobody will remember until everything is already gone. This is one of those moments. Serena Hayes had learned, long before she ever walked into that boardroom, that the most dangerous thing a powerful man can do is confuse a woman's composure with surrender. She had learned it in law school, where she graduated second in her class and watched the man who graduated first get 3 job offers before she received 1. She had learned it in courtrooms, where she prepared every argument and watched senior partners take the credit. She had learned it across 7 years of a marriage that asked her to be brilliant in private and invisible in public. She had learned it, and she had never said a word. That was the thing about Serena. She did not perform her intelligence. She stored it. When she met Kwon Jae-ho, the man the streets called Young, the Dragon, she was 32 years old with a legal mind sharp enough to cut glass and a patience that most people mistook for gentleness. He was already powerful, already dangerous, already surrounded by men who nodded at everything he said and women who smiled on cue. What he did not have, and what he recognized in her immediately, was someone who could think 3 steps ahead of a federal investigation and still make it look like a real estate portfolio. He needed her. He just never admitted it out loud. And that omission, that one quiet refusal to acknowledge what she actually was, became the first crack in the foundation of everything he had built. Serena did not fall in love with the crime. She fell in love with the man who existed underneath it. The rare moments when Jae-ho sat across from her with no lieutenants in the room and no performance to maintain. When the tattooations on his neck seemed less like armor and more like old wounds. And he would look at her like she was the only person in the world who saw him clearly. Those moments were real. She was certain of that even later, when everything else had burned. But love, she would come to understand, is not the same as safety. And loyalty is not the same as leverage. In the world Jae-ho inhabited, loyalty was expected from people beneath you. It was never repaid upward. It was consumed, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. And when there was nothing left to consume, the vessel was replaced. She understood this intellectually long before she felt it personally. The document Jae-ho slid across the table that afternoon was 7 pages long. She read every line. She recognized the language. She had written similar clauses herself, 2 years prior, for a different restructuring that protected the family's holdings in Nevada. She knew exactly what the transfer of management authority meant. She knew exactly whose name would carry the liability. She knew exactly what Ha-eun did not know she was walking into. And in that moment, looking at the signature line, Serena Hayes made a decision that Kwon Jae-ho would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. She picked up the pen. She signed. And she smiled. Not because she was defeated, but because she had just been handed the only thing she had never been able to take for herself in 7 years of careful, measured, deliberate patience. A reason. The thing about men who build empires on silence is that they forget silence has a memory. Every conversation Jae-ho had ever chosen to have in front of Serena because she was his wife, because she was trusted, because she was useful. Every name dropped over dinner, every number discussed in the back seat of an armored car, every meeting she sat beside him for because her presence made things look legitimate. All of it lived somewhere. Not in a filing cabinet, not in a server. In the precise, disciplined, legally trained mind of a woman who had spent 7 years being underestimated by every man in that organization, except, occasionally, the one who should have protected her. She did not go home after she signed the documents. She went to the apartment that did not exist on any record connected to her name. A 2-bedroom unit in Silver Lake, rented 18 months prior under the name of a woman she had gone to law school with. A friend who had never asked questions because Serena had never given her a reason to. The apartment was modest, deliberately so. A kitchen table, a laptop, 2 external hard drives, and a filing system that would have impressed any federal prosecutor who had ever struggled to build a case against organized crime. She had not planned this as revenge. That was the part that people would later misunderstand when the story became public. She had not spent 7 years collecting evidence because she anticipated betrayal. She had done it because she was an attorney, and attorneys do not walk into rooms they cannot walk out of. She had built her exit before she ever needed it. The way a careful person keeps a go bag by the door, not because they expect the house to burn, but because they understand that houses sometimes do. The night after the signing, she sat at the kitchen table and opened the laptop. She did not feel rage. That was important. Not to the story, but to her. She had felt rage once before, years ago, when she first began to understand the architecture of her own invisibility inside Jae-ho's world. She had sat with that feeling long enough to know it was not useful. Rage makes you fast and imprecise. She was neither of those things. What she felt that night was closer to clarity. She opened a folder she had not accessed in 4 months. Inside it were documents, recordings, financial records, and a series of internal communications she had been copied on. Legitimately, as the person who managed the legal compliance layer of the Kwon Holdings structure. Every item had been obtained the same way, by being exactly who they asked her to be. Present, quiet, competent, invisible. She scrolled through the folder slowly, The way a surgeon reviews imaging before an operation. Not looking for something new, confirming what was already there. Then she opened her phone and dialed a number she had been given 2 years prior by a federal agent who approached her at a legal conference in San Francisco. He had been polite, professional. He had handed her a card and said, simply, that if she ever wanted to have a conversation, there was no obligation and no pressure. She had taken the card, put it in her wallet, and said nothing. She had kept it. The line rang twice. A man answered. She told him her name. There was a pause. The kind of pause that tells you someone is sitting up straighter on the other end of the line. She told him she was ready to talk. What followed was not a dramatic confession or an emotional unburdening. It was a 2-hour call that proceeded with the calm precision of a legal deposition. She described the structure of the organization. She identified the shell companies. She explained the flow of funds across 3 states and 2 international accounts. She told him which names on the corporate filings were real and which were phantoms. She told him where the records were, in what format, and how they had been obtained. When she finished, the agent was quiet for a long moment. He asked her one question. He asked her, "Why now?" She looked at the kitchen table, at the laptop, at the city outside the window going about its evening as though nothing was shifting beneath it. She thought about Jae-ho sliding that document across the table. She thought about Ha-eun standing behind him in the red dress, holding the white Chanel bag, not quite able to meet her eyes. She thought about the word he had used, tradition. She thought about 7 years of silence that had been mistaken for compliance. She told the agent, "Because someone just made it very easy for me." She heard him exhale. Then she told him she would need full cooperation terms in writing before she provided a single physical document. He said they could have something to her within 48 hours. She said she would review it herself. She closed the laptop. She made tea. And she slept, for the first time in months, without difficulty. There is a particular kind of blindness that comes with power. It is not the blindness of ignorance. Powerful men are rarely ignorant. It is something more precise and more dangerous than that. It is the blindness of pattern, of repetition, of a world that has confirmed so many times and in so many rooms that the people around you will absorb whatever you decide and remain in place. It is the blindness of a man who has never once watched someone he underestimated walk out of a door and not come back diminished. Kwon Jae-ho had never lost anyone who mattered on their own terms. He had lost people to arrests, to rivals, to decisions that went wrong in the night. But he had never lost someone who left quietly, on a Tuesday, with a signature and a smile, and then simply disappeared from his line of sight. Not dramatically, not with accusations or tears or threats. Just gone. Present enough to avoid suspicion. Absent enough to be completely, surgically free. He noticed it in the weeks that followed. Not her absence. She appeared when necessary, answered messages with appropriate delay, maintained the surface texture of a woman adjusting to a new role. What he noticed was something harder to name, a quality in her stillness that had changed. She had always been composed, but composed people, in his experience, were composed because they were managing something. Fear, ambition, grief, calculation. The composure had a source you could feel if you paid attention. Now there was nothing underneath it. Not emptiness. Something quieter than that. Something that had already arrived somewhere and did not need to move anymore. He mentioned it once to his head of security, a man named Do Sung-min, who had been with the organization for 11 years and who trusted instinct over almost everything else. Sung-min listened. Then he said, carefully, that perhaps they should have someone look more closely at what Serena had access to before the restructuring was finalized. Jae-ho dismissed it. She had signed. She was a consultant now. She was contained. This was the miscalculation that would define everything that followed. Not the decision to promote Ha-eun, not the restructuring, not even the years of treating Serena as infrastructure rather than as a person. The defining miscalculation was this one: the belief that a signature meant conclusion, that a document could be the end of something rather than the beginning. Meanwhile, Ha-eun was beginning to understand the dimensions of what she had walked into. The meetings she was now required to attend were not the meetings she had imagined. They were not dinners with investors, or ribbon-cutting events, or the kind of visible, photographable power she had associated with Jae-ho's world from the outside. They were rooms full of lawyers speaking in careful language about liability structures and regulatory exposure, and the importance of maintaining distance between certain entities. Rooms where everyone seemed to know something she did not, and where her questions were answered with patience that felt, underneath its surface, like condescension. Her name was on everything. She had noticed that early. Had mentioned it to Jae-ho, who told her it was standard, who told her it was necessary for the legitimacy of the transition, who told her, with the same calm authority he used to end every conversation he did not want to continue, that she should trust the process. She had trusted the process, but trust, in that world, was not a two-way architecture. It was a valve. It flowed in one direction, downward, from the man at the top, distributed to the people below him as a managed resource. It was not returned. It was not reciprocal. And the moment Ha-eun began to understand this, she also began to understand something about Serena Hayes that she had not understood when she was standing behind Jae-ho in the boardroom in the red dress. Serena had not been naive. Serena had known exactly what this world was, had understood its geometry completely, and had stayed, not because she was trapped, not because she was weak, but because she had chosen to, for reasons that were her own, until the moment she chose differently. That realization settled over Ha-eun slowly, the way cold settles into a room when a window has been left open overnight. And with it came a fear that had no clean object. Not fear of Jae-ho specifically, not fear of the organization, but the deeper and more disorienting fear of having walked willingly into a position that someone far more capable than her had just walked away from. She called Serena once. She did not know why, exactly. Perhaps she wanted to understand. Perhaps she wanted to apologize. Perhaps she simply wanted to speak to the only person in this world who might answer her honestly. Serena answered on the third ring. The conversation was brief. Ha-eun asked her if she was all right. Serena said yes. Ha-eun paused. A long pause, full of everything she did not know how to say, and then asked, quietly, whether Serena had ever been afraid. Serena considered the question with the same unhurried attention she gave everything. Then she said, "Fear is useful when it tells you something true. The problem is learning to hear it before the moment passes." Ha-eun did not fully understand the answer. She would later, much later. When the agents knocked on her door at 20 minutes past 6 in the morning and she saw her own name on the warrant, and she understood with sudden and complete clarity exactly what Serena had been trying to tell her. The moment had already passed. The morning the federal warrants were executed, Los Angeles was unusually quiet. It was the kind of morning that arrives without intention. Cool air, pale light, the city not yet fully awake. the streets belonging briefly to delivery drivers and joggers and people walking dogs who had no idea that in 4 simultaneous locations across 3 states, teams of federal agents were preparing to move on an organization that had operated without serious interference for nearly a decade. Jae-ho was on the 41st floor of the hotel he owned outright, the flagship property of Kwon Holdings, the building whose lobby had been featured in 2 architecture magazines, and whose penthouse suites were booked by people who never asked about the ownership structure, because the ownership structure had been designed very carefully to never invite questions. He was drinking coffee. He was reading messages on his phone. Nothing urgent. The ordinary rhythm of early morning communications from people in different time zones who needed small confirmations. His jacket was draped over the chair beside him. His watch caught the morning light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city below him looked exactly as it always had, ordered, indifferent, functioning. And there was nothing in the texture of that morning that told him it was the last one he would spend in that room as a free man. That was how it always happens, not with sirens in the distance, not with a warning that arrives in time to matter, with coffee and morning light, and the ordinary sounds of a world that has already made its decision and simply has not announced it yet. The knock on the door came at 6:22. He did not panic. That was consistent with who he was. Kwon Jae-ho had built his entire identity around the refusal to show fear. And even now, opening the door to find 4 federal agents with badges and a warrant printed on paper he immediately recognized as legitimate, his face did not break. He looked at the document. He looked at the lead agent. He asked with complete steadiness whether he could put on his jacket. They told him yes. He put on his jacket. He straightened the collar. He looked once, just once, at the city through the window, at the empire spread below him in glass and concrete and the accumulated weight of a decade of careful, ruthless construction. Then he put his hands behind his back and he walked out. The cameras caught it all. A news crew that had been tipped, by whom no one would officially confirm, was positioned at the hotel entrance when he emerged. The footage went everywhere within the hour. Kwon Jae-ho, the dragon, in a charcoal suit with the neck tattoos visible above the collar, hands cuffed behind him, face controlled, but eyes carrying something that the commentators would spend days debating. Some called it defiance. Some called it shock. One journalist, who had covered organized crime for 19 years, wrote in her piece that evening that what she saw in his face was not either of those things. It was the expression, she wrote, of a man who had just understood something too late. Ha-eun's arrest was quieter and considerably less composed. The agents came to the apartment Jae-ho had leased in her name, the apartment with the cobertura views and the wardrobe full of clothes chosen to project a specific image. And she opened the door in a robe, holding her phone, completely unprepared for what was standing in the hallway. The white Chanel bag was on the entryway table. The red dress from the boardroom was hung on a garment rack near the window. She looked at the warrant, and then looked at the agents, and said, in a voice that had lost all its careful construction, "But my name is just on the paperwork." The agent who responded to her did so with the particular gentleness reserved for people who are discovering, in real time, that they have been used. He told her that the paperwork was exactly the problem. She sat down on the floor of her own hallway and did not get up for several minutes. The cooperation agreement Serena had negotiated was 31 pages long. She had reviewed every clause herself, requested 3 amendments, and signed only after the 3rd amendment was accepted in full. The federal prosecutor who worked with her would later describe her, in a deposition summary that became part of the public record, as the most prepared and methodical cooperating witness his office had ever worked with. Every piece of evidence she provided was documented, sourced, and presented in a format that required almost no additional preparation for court use. She had essentially, he noted with professional admiration, pre-built a significant portion of the prosecution's case. She was not present for the arrests. She was at the office she had rented 3 weeks prior, a corner unit on the 11th floor of a building in downtown Los Angeles, modest by the standards she had grown accustomed to, but entirely and completely hers. The Hayes legal group letterhead had arrived the day before, and she had spent part of the previous evening arranging the small details of the space. Not because the details were urgent, but because she had learned, across years of living inside someone else's architecture, that the details of a space tell you something essential about whose life you are actually living. This space was hers. Every detail confirmed it. She learned about the arrests from the news, the same way everyone else did. She watched the footage of Jae-ho being walked out of the hotel, watched it once, without expression, standing at the window of her office with a cup of tea cooling in her hand. She watched his face. She watched the moment the cameras caught him at the entrance, the city behind him, the cuffs visible, the jacket he had asked to put on because even in that moment he needed to maintain the architecture of who he believed himself to be. She felt something. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she felt something. But it was not triumph. It was not the hot satisfaction that people tend to expect from a story that ends this way. It was something quieter and more complicated. The particular emotion of watching a thing you once loved reveal itself, completely and finally, as exactly what you had always known it was, in a moment that is too late to change anything and too real to look away from. She finished her tea. She set the cup down. She sat at her desk, in her office, under her name on the door, and she opened her laptop and began drafting the client intake forms for the Hayes Legal Group's first week of operation. The phone rang twice that morning with numbers she did not recognize. She did not answer. The third call was from a former colleague at a firm she had left years ago, who had seen the news and remembered her connection to Kwon Holdings, and was calling, she said, to check in. Serena thanked her, said she was fine, said she was busy, actually. The office was new and there was a great deal to organize. Her colleague paused, and then asked, with the tentative curiosity of someone who wants to ask a larger question but does not quite know how to form it, "Did you know this was coming?" Serena looked at the window, at the city, at the ordinary, indifferent, functioning world going about its morning as though nothing beneath it had shifted. She thought about a boardroom on a Tuesday afternoon, a document slid across a table, a pen, a signature, a smile that did not reach her eyes. She thought about 7 years of silence that everyone had mistaken for stillness. "I knew," she said simply. "I was just waiting for the right moment." Her colleague did not know what to say to that. Serena thanked her for calling, told her she would be in touch, and ended the call. Then she turned back to her desk, and she went to work.
What did you think about this story? My name is Angela Denise Carter, and I specialize in helping women break free from emotional patterns that keep them confused, drained, and disconnected from themselves. And maybe that is exactly why this story stayed with you. Not because it was just emotional, but because it touched something real. Too many women spend years trying to understand people who only bring confusion. They keep waiting for clarity. They keep giving chances. They keep making excuses for what already feels wrong. And little by little, they stop noticing how much of themselves they are giving away. If you saw yourself in that, I left something for you. Something to help you recognize the signs sooner, rebuild your emotional clarity, and stop settling for less than you deserve. You can get to it through the QR code on the screen. the link in the description, or the pinned comment.
If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever given someone your absolute loyalty, your time, your silence, your sacrifice, only to be dismissed the moment they decided you were no longer convenient? Have you ever been underestimated so completely that the person who underestimated you never saw what was coming until it was already too late? And have you ever had to choose between protecting the love you felt for someone and protecting the truth of who you actually are? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about justice, dignity, and the quiet power of those who are underestimated, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a part of our community and help the channel.